They said grief should be quiet, polite, pretty, that if I loved him, I'd sit and nod along like everyone else. But grief, real grief, doesn't lie, and neither do I. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 72 years old. I was Charles Whitmore's wife for 47 years. At least that's what the world called me, his wife. To him, I was more of an accessory, a background figure, a convenient alibi. We buried Charles on a warm Sunday morning in May. The air smelled like cut grass and cheap perfume. People came in polished shoes, clutching tissues, ready to speak about what a great man he was. They shook my hand like I was the grieving queen of a well-loved king. And when I walked in, Claire, my only daughter, met me at the entrance with a careful smile and said, "You're not speaking today, right? It's probably better if you just listen." It wasn't a suggestion. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I had already decided. I wasn't going to interrupt their ceremony. I was going to wait for them to empty their cups of praise, wait for the rehearsed eulogies and over-polished lies to finish echoing off the church walls. Then, and only then, I'd speak. See, for decades, I did what I was told. I smiled when I didn't want to. I stayed quiet when I knew the truth. I showed up, dressed properly, hands folded, head down, like a good wife. But that day? That was my line in the sand. Because here's the thing no one at that memorial knew. The man they were honoring wasn't the man I buried. Not really. The man they cried for, the man they called noble and strong and a leader in the community, was a ghost, a mask. One he wore flawlessly for almost 5 decades. The real Charles Whitmore didn't belong in speeches. He belonged in silence, because that's where he did the most damage, behind closed doors, behind my eyes, behind my silence. They didn't know what he took from me. They didn't know what he took from others. They didn't know what he left behind when he drew his last breath, not just a will, but a wound. You don't live with someone for nearly half a century and not gather truths. Some of them you stumble upon. Others you carry like splinters for so long you forget how they got there. But I remembered. I remembered everything. I remember the first time he called me stupid. I was 25. I'd made the bank transfer incorrectly. He said it loud enough for the neighbor to hear. If I wanted a wife who couldn't count, I'd have married a porcelain doll. He laughed like it was a joke, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes, and neither did mine. I remember the time he told our pastor that I wasn't strong enough to lead the women's circle, said I'd get overwhelmed, that I wasn't built for leadership. Meanwhile, I was managing all the books for the local food drive while he took credit in his speeches. I remember sitting in the back row of every legal award ceremony, smiling as he stood at the podium, thanking God, his colleagues, and his rock Margaret, a rock he chipped away at quietly when no one was watching. And I remember that one Sunday morning when Claire, still in her teens, said, "Mom, stop making everything dramatic. Dad's just trying to help." That's when I realized even my daughter had learned to dismiss me, so I stayed quiet, because no one wanted the truth from me. They wanted the version of Margaret that fit neatly into Charles' world, polished, pleasant, predictable. But what they didn't understand was that I had been watching, waiting, and remembering. You can't love someone that long and not hold pieces of their soul in your hand. And you also can't be betrayed that deeply and not feel it hollow out your spine. So when they told me not to speak at his memorial, I agreed. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted them all to feel safe before I spoke. I wanted the room to be full. I wanted the podium to be warm. I wanted every seat taken, every head turned, every heart open to the lie. So when I told the truth, it would crack clean through the center of their illusion. They had spent their breath glorifying the mask, but I knew the man beneath it. And I was done protecting him, not because I hated him, but because, for the first time in my life, I finally loved myself more. They called him a pillar, a man of virtue, of discipline, of unwavering moral compass. I sat there, second row, her right side, between Claire and the pastor's wife, as one speaker after another stepped up to the podium and painted Charles in hues of gold. "Judge Whitmore taught me what integrity looks like," said the city councilman. "He gave back without ever asking for thanks," said the director of the charity board. "He raised a daughter who embodies grace, humility, and strength," said the minister. And every time they said something like that, I felt a little part of me grow colder, not angry, just disconnected, like they were talking about a stranger I'd never met, because the man they remembered, the one they called mentor, visionary, beloved husband and father, was not the man who came home every night and dropped his keys on the counter without looking me in the eye. They didn't know the Charles who measured silence like currency, who could go 3 days without speaking to me if I disagreed with him. They didn't know the Charles who once said, "If I ever lose my position, it'll be because you couldn't keep your mouth shut." He said it over breakfast. I remember because I burned the toast that morning, my hands shaking too much to butter it. But oh, how he performed in public. He had this charming way of putting a hand on someone's shoulder, tilting his head with just the right amount of sympathy. He remembered birthdays, names, graduations. He shook every hand with both of his own like he meant it. And he was smart, brilliant even. That part wasn't a lie. He rose through the ranks quickly. A defense attorney in his early 30s, a judge by 42, the youngest ever appointed to our county's bench. Local news adored him. Churches invited him to speak. Students shadowed him like he was royalty. They didn't see the scowl behind the smile, the temper simmering just beneath the surface, the man who punished disagreement like it was betrayal. I suppose it's easy to love someone from a distance, much harder when you share a bed with him for almost 5 decades. Claire idolized her father, still does, even now. To her, he was the man who bought her first car, helped her with her law school essays, and walked her down the aisle in front of 200 guests. But she never asked why I cried in the bathroom that morning. She never noticed the way he gripped my wrist when I adjusted his tie wrong before the ceremony. She didn't know that the check for her wedding was from my late mother's inheritance, money Charles claimed to have lost in an investment, until I tracked the records myself. I kept that checkbook, still have it. Sometimes the truth hides in ledgers. But that day, in that room full of mourners, all anyone wanted to remember was the myth. And myths don't leave bruises. They spoke about how he mentored troubled young men, never knowing he'd once told our neighbor that those boys were a waste of state funding. They praised his gentle spirit and moral backbone, words that sounded like music to those who never heard him yell. But I had. And I remember thinking, even then, how strange it is to bury someone who died with a crown he never earned. Still, I let them speak, all of them. Let them cry. Let them believe. Let them baptize his legacy in their memories. Because that's what people want when they grieve, isn't it? They don't want truth. They want comfort. They want to believe the person they lost was whole, was worthy, was good. And I didn't come to rob them of that. Not yet. But I also didn't come to sit silently and swallow another half-baked version of the man I sacrificed my life to support. They praised his discipline, but I knew his cruelty. They praised his generosity, but I knew how many people he used, how many he erased once they'd served his purpose. They praised his loyalty, and that was the one that made my hands clench in my lap until my knuckles went white. Because loyalty was the lie that almost killed me. It was the weapon he used the longest. He asked for it constantly, demanded it, but never once offered it in return. So when I finally stood at that podium, and I wouldn't do it to tarnish a legacy. I would do it to reclaim a voice. Mine. Because behind every powerful man is a woman people pretend not to see, until she finally steps forward and speaks. People always say, "You must have loved him." 47 years is long time. Yes, it is. It's long enough to lose yourself twice, and long enough to know when someone was never truly yours to begin with. Charles and I met in 1973. He was newly graduated, sharp suit, sharp smile, the kind of man who walked into a room and made people stand up straighter. I was working as a part-time school librarian, teaching night classes on American literature, dreaming of becoming a professor. He noticed me at a town hall meeting. I was asking about budget cuts to the local library. Afterward, he approached me and said, "A woman who defends books? I think I've just met my match." I remember blushing, foolishly proud. No one had ever looked at me that way before, like I was worthy. He proposed a year later, said he wanted a woman with a good mind and a quiet voice. I didn't think much of it then, but looking back, that's exactly what I became. The early years were filled with rules wrapped in ribbons. Let me take care of the finances. It'll be less stressful for you. Don't worry about applying for that fellowship. It'll take too much time away from our marriage. Why work so hard? You don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I told myself it was love. That being chosen by a man like him was a kind of success. But that's how it starts. Little by little, your life becomes his. He didn't hit me, never raised a hand. And that's what made it so easy to excuse. But emotional cruelty doesn't bruise the same way. It stains the mind. It lives in the silence between dinner bites. It lives in the way you hesitate before you speak, wondering if what you say will earn a sigh, an eye roll, or 3 days of distance. When we bought our home, this grand Victorian house he'd always wanted, I asked if we could turn the attic into a reading room for me. He said, "That would be a waste of space. We'll make it a guest suite. You don't need a whole room to yourself." I agreed. Then again, when Claire was born, I asked if I could go back to teaching part-time. He replied, "What kind of mother puts her career before her child?" And that was that. Every time I asked for a piece of myself back, he took something else instead. By the time I was in my 40s, I couldn't even remember what dreams were mine and what were his. He dictated how we spent money, who we spent time with, what I wore to formal events. Once I bought a simple burgundy dress with my own birthday money, wore it to a banquet he was speaking at. After the event, in the car, he said, "Do you enjoy making us both look cheap?" I never wore it again. I stopped talking much at social functions, because when I did, he'd correct me, publicly, on details that didn't matter. Or worse, laugh and say, "My wife's memory isn't what it used to be." Even when I was barely 45, people laughed with him. They always did. He was charming enough to make a lie sound like a compliment. And slowly, I shrank. I stopped decorating the way I liked, stopped reading the books I loved, stopped questioning how he always seemed to have time for long, working weekends while I stayed home with Claire. He took over our church's outreach committee and made me the unofficial secretary. I handled the calls, the forms, the tedious work. He got the praise. And still, I told myself, this is what marriage looks like. This is how you stay together. This is just what men do. But one night, while he was sleeping in the den, after one of his late-night brandy-fueled sulks, I stood in the hallway looking at his outline through the frosted glass door, and I whispered to myself, "This man has built an empire on your silence." And I realized something chilling. He didn't just need me quiet. He expected it, depended on it. Because if I ever spoke, really spoke, everything he'd built could fall. Still, I stayed. Because I thought loyalty made me good, and leaving made me selfish. What I didn't know yet was that loyalty to the wrong person is just slow-motion self-destruction, and one envelope, one single letter, would make that truth undeniable. But that didn't come until the spring of '86. The day I found out Charles had lied, openly, casually, devastatingly. And even then, I wasn't ready to face what that meant. Not yet. But the seed of fire was planted, and I would never look at him the same again. It was April of 1986. I remember because the daffodils were blooming late that year, and Claire had just turned 15. We'd thrown her a small birthday gathering, nothing lavish, just close friends, paper streamers, and a cake from the local bakery she liked. Charles stayed for the photos, gave a generous smile for the neighbors, and then disappeared upstairs for an urgent call about a zoning dispute. That night, after the last guest left and Claire went off to bed still wearing her party hat, I started cleaning up the kitchen. Charles hadn't come back down. Hours passed. At some point, I noticed his briefcase still sitting by the coat rack, unopened. That was unlike him. He was meticulous about unpacking right away, said it kept his mind uncluttered. I didn't intend to open it, I swear to you, I didn't. But as I was placing his folded coat on the back of the chair, the briefcase tipped. It clicked open slightly. A paper peeked out. Not legal briefs, not files. An envelope. Handwritten. And when I saw the name on the return address, Helen Monroe, something in my stomach twisted. The envelope was already opened, the flap barely tucked in. I pulled the letter out like I was stealing from someone else's life. I wish I had left it alone. It started with, "Dearest Charles, I hope your week back at court isn't too exhausting." I read the whole thing standing by the kitchen sink, still wearing my apron. Helen wrote about a weekend they had in the hills, how she still thought about his hands on her waist, how she'd laughed so hard at something he'd said over dinner that wine came out her nose. She apologized for being too forward, but said she was thinking of naming the baby after him. The baby. I remember my knees giving out slightly. I had to sit, the room tilted sideways. I read the letter 3 more times, slowly, like maybe I'd misunderstood, like maybe Charles was someone else, some old flame she was writing out of nostalgia. But the context was too clear, too intimate. I held the page up to my chest and just breathed, tried to steady myself. My first instinct was denial. My second was rage. But what I did was wait. I put the letter back exactly where I found it, closed the briefcase, and set his coat beside it like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional sound of Charles's snoring down the hall, and I made a choice. I would confront him, calmly, directly. I wanted answers, not tears, not yelling, just the truth. The next evening after dinner, I asked him if we could talk. He gave me that slight tilt of the head, the one he always used when he thought I was being overly sensitive. I said, "I found a letter from someone named Helen Monroe." His fork paused. Then he sighed, deeply, dramatically, like I'd just accused him of murder. "Margaret," he said, "Helen is a deeply troubled woman. She used to be part of a housing case I worked on. She's unstable. She sends me things like that from time to time." "Why would she say she was naming a baby after you?" He rolled his eyes. "She was obsessed. I never touched her. Never gave her a reason to think there was anything between us. You're letting your imagination run wild. Honestly, it's insulting." That last word, insulting, hit me like a slap. He wasn't sorry. He was offended that I'd even asked. I stared at him across the table, and in that moment I saw the truth, but I didn't yet have the courage to hold it. I told myself, maybe he was right. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the woman was unstable. But 2 days later, the letter was gone. Not filed away, not packed. Gone. And when I asked where it went, Charles said, "I threw it out. I didn't want that poison in our home." He said it with such calm finality that I almost believed I was the one who needed to apologize. I didn't bring it up again, but I never forgot the name, Helen Monroe. And I never forgot the tone in his voice when he dismissed it all. It wasn't guilt, it was entitlement. That was the first time I saw Charles for who he truly was. Not a man who made a mistake, but a man who believed he could make them and never answer for them. And I, like so many others, let him. Not because I was weak, but because I wasn't ready. Not yet. but a crack had opened. And eventually, even marble gives way to time and pressure. They say time heals, but sometimes time just teaches you how to bleed more quietly. After Helen Monroe, something changed in me. I didn't confront Charles again, not for a long time. I didn't scream or leave or demand an explanation the way younger women might now, the way I wish I had. I folded that pain and tucked it away like a napkin over a stained dress, because I still believed if I stayed, if I held this family together, I would earn my worth. That if I forgave him quietly enough, he'd stop lying, maybe even love me better. But lies, I learned, don't end with apologies. They multiply in silence. I began noticing other things. A perfume I didn't wear lingering on his collars. Business dinners that turned into overnight trips. Always unexpected. Always with clients who don't respect boundaries. An unfamiliar gold bracelet found in his car's glove box. When I asked about it, he laughed and said, "A judge's car gets searched sometimes. Maybe one of the interns left it. Why are you acting paranoid?" That word, paranoid, he used it often. It was his favorite leash. He didn't have to prove anything. He just had to make me doubt myself. And I did, at least for a while. But deep down, I knew, even if I couldn't say it out loud. Charles was a man of appetites, and I had stopped being one he desired long ago. Still, I stayed, because Claire was watching, because I didn't want her to grow up with a broken home, because I was terrified of what people would say if I left the great Charles Whitmore. And maybe, in some secret corner of my heart, I still hoped he would choose me. It's foolish to admit that now, but back then, when all your worth has been poured into someone else, you cling to their approval like air. But with every year that passed, it became clearer. I was a convenience, not a companion. By the late 1990s, Claire had become her father's shadow. She admired his courtroom prowess, his command in every room. She didn't see the man who barely acknowledged my birthday, who once referred to my migraines as dramatics, or who told her, "Your mother doesn't understand law or logic. Don't burden her with things she can't grasp." And she believed him. Even after overhearing him shout at me in the kitchen one morning, calling me deadweight, exhausting, ungrateful. Claire later said, "Mom, you probably just misunderstood him. He's under so much pressure." That's the trouble with men like Charles. They don't have to erase you. They just train the world to look past you. I began fading from family photos. He'd move Claire to the center, and I'd be at the edge, half in frame. When holiday cards were printed, they featured Charles and Claire smiling at charity galas. I was the one holding the camera. At church events, people called me Mrs. Whitmore with reverence, as if being his wife made me sacred. Not one ever asked what I did, and when Charles started, referring to our legacy, he never included me in the vision. It was always about him and Claire. A father-daughter duo built on admiration and performance. I was just the silent figure in the wings. He made me feel like a relic of his past, useful for appearances, inconvenient up close. And then came the moment that sealed everything, Claire's law school graduation. He had organized a private dinner for her, invited judges, professors, donors. He stood to give a toast, glass raised, and said, "Raising Claire has been the greatest joy of my life. I did it alone, really. Margaret was always more hands-off." I sat there, stunned. Alone? I was the one who stayed up helping her with college essays. I was the one who taught her how to speak publicly without shaking. I was the one who skipped my own mother's funeral to stay with Claire during exams, because Charles was too busy at trial. But there he was, rewriting history in front of a room full of power, and no one questioned it, not even Claire. She smiled, clinked her glass with his, and I just sat there, numb. Something inside me hardened that night. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of quiet resolution. If he was going to erase me while I was still alive, then I'd make sure the truth outlived him. I didn't know how yet, didn't know when, but I started saving things. copies of receipts, records of calls, little things he never thought I'd notice, let alone keep, because I knew this much. A storm was coming, and one day, when the house of lies collapsed, I'd be the one standing in the wreckage holding the blueprint. It was the spring of 1998 when the cracks in Charles's reputation almost became visible to everyone else. I remember the exact moment it started, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Silence had always been his weapon, but that year it became mine too. The phone rang one evening just after dinner. Claire had just passed the bar and was upstairs packing for a celebratory trip to New York that Charles had arranged. I answered the landline. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman on the other end asked, voice trembling. "I'm not sure if I should be calling, but I didn't know he was married." I didn't say anything. My heart had stopped. She continued. "He said he was divorced. I'm sorry, I didn't know who else to warn. They're asking questions at the courthouse about him, about what he said to me." Then she hung up. No name, no explanation, just a voice. But I already knew. 2 days later, it hit the local circuit. A court clerk had filed a formal complaint against Judge Whitmore. Inappropriate language, inappropriate advances, abusing professional influence. Of course, it never made the front page. Not in our town. Charles had too many friends, too many connections, too many strings. But whispers moved through the courthouse like wildfire. I found out from one of the deacons at church. He took me aside in the parking lot, voice low and rehearsed, and said, "Margaret, this'll pass. But Charles, he'll need you to show support right now. Appearances matter. Appearances. Always appearances." That night, Charles came home with that same confident, calm air, as if the storm wasn't even touching him. He tossed his keys on the counter, poured himself a scotch, and sat down like nothing had changed. I stood across from him and asked, "Is it true?" He didn't flinch, just took a long sip and said, "There's always someone who can't handle rejection. She's making a name for herself." I said, "She didn't sound like she wanted attention." He smiled, not kindly. "Then she should have stayed quiet, just like you always have." That line, it stayed with me. He was right, of course. I had stayed quiet. I had defended him, covered for him, explained his absences, smoothed over his moods, held the hand of his mother when he couldn't be bothered to show up at the hospital. And now, he wanted me to save him again. 3 days later, he handed me a speech. A short paragraph, barely 200 words. It praised his integrity, his commitment to ethics, his love for justice. At the bottom was a line that said, "As his wife, I know firsthand the strength and dignity Charles carries every day." He asked me to read it at a press dinner, not to write it, not to believe it, just to say it. I stared at those words and realized I had two choices. Either betray myself or keep pretending the betrayal was worth something. And I'll admit, I considered walking away that night. I even packed a suitcase. Took $400 I'd hidden in the pantry in a jar behind the lentils. It was the first money I'd ever set aside for myself since our wedding. But I couldn't go. Not because I loved him, but because, by then, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. And I wasn't ready to be the one to leave in shame while he stayed behind, golden and untarnished. I didn't want Claire to believe him without ever hearing me. I didn't want the town to close the book on poor Charles abandoned by his wife during hard times. So I stayed, and I read the speech. I wore my best navy dress. He said it made me look respectable. I smiled for the cameras. I spoke the words. And inside, I was memorizing every detail of his downfall as it unfolded in slow motion. Because here's what he didn't know. While he was saving his face, I was building a case. I started keeping records, scans of notes, dates, travel receipts that didn't match, letters he thought I never saw. I even recorded some of our conversations, just in case. Back then, I didn't know what I'd ever do with all of it, but collecting it made me feel like I wasn't crazy. Like I hadn't imagined the years. I was documenting my own survival. The court complaint was quietly dismissed 2 months later, settled with a confidentiality agreement, and the clerk transferred to a different district. Charles emerged untarnished. The press said he was vindicated. He smiled and called it a misunderstanding. And no one asked about the woman again. But I remembered her voice, the way it cracked, the way she apologized for not knowing he was married. And I kept her name, wrote it down in a notebook I labeled, "Truths He'll Never Outrun." It was around that time I stopped thinking of myself as his wife. I wasn't. I was his mirror. And one day, I was going to turn around and show the world what he really looked like. There's something powerful about writing things down when no one believes you. It makes them real, tangible, yours. After the incident with the clerk and the way Charles brushed it off like a smear on his cuff, I began documenting everything, not just out of anger, but survival. I knew that someday, maybe not next week or next year, but someday the truth would need a voice. And if mine was too cracked or too old to speak it, I wanted the paper trail to speak for me. It started small. A hotel receipt dated for a weekend he told me he was at a judicial retreat. But the hotel was in Chicago, not upstate. I found it folded in a dry cleaning receipt in his jacket. I tucked it away. Then came a set of 2 theater tickets, billed under a woman's name I didn't recognize, Eva Sutton, row D, center balcony. Charles told me he was in court late that night. I cooked dinner for just me and watched the clock until midnight. I pressed the ticket stubs flat in a binder. I became meticulous. Dates, times, names, even weather patterns. He had no idea. He never asked what I did with my days, never imagined I'd stopped baking or reading novels and started logging his life behind his back. I kept everything in a locked drawer behind the linen closet, beneath the old towels no one touched. By the early 2000s, I had 4 binders. By 2010, I had a locked chest. Inside it, printed emails, photos he thought he'd deleted, snippets of voicemail messages, canceled checks made out to names that weren't his law firm or mine, and a small cassette recorder I'd use when he started ranting after one drink too many. He never hit me, never bruised me. But the emotional wounds, the condescension, the contempt, I recorded it all, and not once did I plan to go public. At the time, it wasn't revenge I wanted. It was proof that I hadn't imagined my own life, that I hadn't spent 40 years gasping under the weight of someone else's lie. Claire, of course, still saw him as a titan. He was funding her firm by then, helping her with client referrals, taking her to luncheons and introducing her to his network as the real future of Whitmore legacy. She never asked where I was during those moments. At home, always home. Cleaning dishes that weren't mine, folding suits I didn't wear, listening to him joke with clients on speakerphone, using charm like a scalpel. He'd call me sweetheart when they were on the line. "Can you get us another round of tea, honey?" But as soon as he hung up, "Don't hover." God, you make things awkward. So I stopped hovering and started recording. One afternoon in 2015, I caught a conversation I never intended to hear. He was in his study, door cracked. I was passing by when I heard him speaking low and deliberate. "No, she has no idea. Margaret's docile, always has been. You don't need to worry about her getting in the way." He was talking about me. I froze. The will is done. Claire gets the properties, the trust, the accounts. Margaret doesn't need anything. She's lived off me long enough. I stood there, knees locked, heart pounding, not even a mention, not a dollar. After decades of marriage, he had written me out like a bad line in a speech. I didn't move until he ended the call, and I didn't cry. That surprised me. No tears, just a cold, sobering clarity. He was never going to change, but I already had. The next day, I called a lawyer, a woman named Teresa with iron gray hair and eyes like mine. She listened to everything. She didn't blink. And when I pulled out the first binder, she exhaled softly and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, this isn't just a record. This is a life's work." She helped me quietly restructure what little funds I could move into my name, helped me document Charles's financial decisions that affected me, even ones I hadn't understood at the time. She warned me it would be hard, but I told her, I've lived hard. This question mark. This is just the preface. After that, I kept building the archive, not out of spite, out of preparation. Because when you've been dismissed for most of your life, you realize that proof matters, not to those who love you, but to those who will one day pretend they did. And I knew that day would come. Maybe after his death, maybe sooner, but it would come. And when it did, they wouldn't be able to say, she's exaggerating. They wouldn't be able to say, she's confused. Because I had names, dates, signatures, voices, and enough truth in that locked chest to break a legacy clean in half. It started with a tremble in his right hand, barely noticeable at first. Charles blamed it on a pinched nerve from too much writing. He said the judge's bench wasn't ergonomic. I watched him fumble to button his shirt one morning and pretend not to notice that his wrist wouldn't stay still. But I noticed. I always noticed. A month later, he dropped a glass during a dinner with one of Claire's clients. He laughed it off, said he was getting clumsy in his old age. Everyone chuckled politely and pretended it didn't matter. But after they left, he turned to me, eyes sharp and venomous. Don't you dare say a word about this. Not to Claire, not to anyone. You understand me? I did, because I'd spent my life understanding him. But I also made a quiet note in my binder. May 12th, right. Hand tremor worsening, denial increasing, temper sharper. Eventually, he couldn't deny it anymore. The diagnosis came a few weeks later. Parkinson's disease, progressive, unforgiving, a slow unraveling of control, the very thing Charles had built his entire life upon. The specialist tried to soften the blow, offered options, medications, routines. But Charles didn't hear a word. He left the appointment in silence. And for the first time in years, he didn't tell me to stop talking. He just walked to the car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. In the weeks that followed, he became different. Not softer, not humbled, just smaller. He stopped going to public events, stopped speaking engagements. He refused to let anyone know, even Claire, said it would weaken the brand. That's what he called it, his reputation, a brand. I became his caregiver, not by request, by default, helping him with shaving, with dressing, with walking to the mailbox. He grunted more than he spoke, lost in his own bitterness, which somehow only made him more vicious when he did speak. Don't pity me, he spat once, when I tried to help him out of the bathtub. This disease will take me, but it won't make me pathetic. I wanted to tell him that cruelty is what makes a man pathetic, but I bit my tongue. I always had, until the day I found the updated will. He'd been reviewing documents at his desk, shaking hands, struggling to hold the pen. I brought him tea and saw a folder with his name on it, legal in size, heavy with signatures. I set the cup down, and he shooed me away like I was an assistant. When he left for his afternoon nap, I opened it. It was a revision, recent, dated just a few weeks back. Everything, every account, every property, every asset was left to Claire. Not a word about me, not a trust, not a clause, not even the house I'd cleaned every week for 47 years. I stood there, reading it again and again, as if my name might appear if I stared hard enough. But it didn't. He hadn't forgotten. He had erased me, on purpose. I waited until dinner to confront him. I needed the rage to settle into something colder, something calm. I placed the folder gently beside his plate. He looked at it, then looked at me, and said nothing. I saw it, I told him, my voice barely above a whisper. All of it. After everything, you left me nothing. He picked up his fork, didn't even blink. You'll be fine. You've always had a roof, and Claire will take care of things. Claire. His mirror, his legacy. She, who once told me I was being too emotional about being left out of a charity event they hosted in my own home. "You think I lived off you?" I asked. "Is that what you really believe?" He finally looked at me. "Margaret, we both know you were never built for more than support. I handled the big things. You made the home. That was the arrangement. An arrangement." As if I were a housekeeper he'd given a long-term lease. That was the moment the final thread snapped. Not from rage, not from sadness, but from release. Because now, it was clear. There would be no apology, no reckoning, no moment where he finally looked at me and said, "Thank you for holding me up." There would only be this, a man deteriorating into illness, gripping the tattered scraps of his vanity, and me, holding years of truth in a locked chest, finally understanding why I had kept it all. He didn't just plan to leave this world without me. He planned to leave everything to everyone else, except the woman who cleaned his blood from the sink when he nicked himself shaving. That night, I opened my chest. I laid it all out on the floor of the guest room. The letters, the files, the audio tapes, the names of women, and I sat in the center of it, cross-legged on the rug, like a woman building her own fire, because the funeral was coming, and so was the reckoning. Charles passed in the early hours of a Thursday morning. I was there, sitting in the wingback chair across from his hospital bed, knitting needles idle in my lap. The nurse had just stepped out. The machines beeped steadily until they didn't. He didn't gasp. He didn't flinch. He just left. After everything, his exit was quiet. No final words, no dramatic apologies, no hand squeeze of regret. He simply drifted away like smoke slipping beneath a door. I didn't cry. I sat still, stared at the blue-gray of his lips, and felt something unexpected. Not grief, not relief, permission. And that terrified me more than anything. The nurse returned. There were phone calls, paperwork, signatures. Claire arrived an hour later, cheeks wet, face pale. She collapsed against me in the hallway and said, "It was too soon. He was supposed to keep fighting." I said nothing. She didn't know that he'd already surrendered years ago, just not to his illness, to himself. That evening, the planning began. Claire took control immediately, as if she'd been waiting for the role all along. "We'll hold the service at St. Andrew's," she said over the phone to the funeral director. "Private invite, black tie only. We want legacy speakers, senators, judges, the mayor if he's available." She turned to me and asked, "You're okay with that, right? You don't want to deal with the details. Not would you like to help, not what would Dad have wanted, just, you'll sit this one out, right?" I nodded, because I was past the point of trying to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was. She printed programs without my input, picked the music, the floral arrangements, the speakers. When I asked gently if we could include something simpler, maybe a hymn he liked from our early church years, she waved a hand. "This isn't about nostalgia, Mom. This is about what people expect." What people expect. That phrase echoed in my ears like a funeral bell. The night before the service, Claire came by to drop off my outfit, a tailored black dress in a garment bag. Not something I picked, something she chose. "This one's dignified," she said. "It photographs well." Photographs well. I almost laughed. They were burying him like a celebrity, not a husband. Before she left, she stood in the doorway and said, "Mom, I need you to promise me something." I looked up from my chair. "Please don't speak at the service. I don't think it would be helpful." There it was, the polite muzzle, the same one Charles had fitted me with for decades, only now it came in my daughter's voice. "I think," she added, "we should focus on the good, on his accomplishments. That's what people need right now." I could have argued, could have screamed, "What about what I need?" But instead, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I understand." Because I did. They weren't mourning a man. They were mourning an image, a a story carefully curated and held together by years of silence. And they didn't want the truth. They wanted to be comforted by the myth. Claire kissed me on the cheek and left, and I sat there, holding the garment bag in my lap like it was a costume for a play I had never auditioned for. That night, I made my own preparations. I went to the guest room, opened the chest, and carefully selected what I would carry with me. Not papers, not binders, just a manila envelope. Light, unassuming. Inside, a copy of the will, a photo from 1986, Charles and Helen Monroe, arms around each other, smiling, a printed transcript of one of his calls from 2015, and a folded note with dates and names, his travel records, the matching receipts. I tucked it into my purse. Ironically, the same purse I had carried to Claire's wedding. It still had a safety pin in the inner lining where the zipper broke. Funny, the things we carry, what we patch, what we hide. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, turning over every moment, every wound, every time I bit my tongue when I should have spoken. And then I made one final decision. I would follow their rules, dress in black, sit quietly, nod at the right moments. But when they asked, if they asked, whether anyone wanted to speak at the end, I would rise, and I would speak, not to retaliate, not to destroy, but to reclaim. Because I was tired of being the footnote in a man's legacy I helped build. I was ready to be the author of my own ending. The church was packed, rows upon rows of polished shoes and pressed suits. Perfume and aftershave hung heavy in the air, masking the scent of lilies and sorrow. Programs were handed out like sacred scripts, each one adorned with a full-color photo of Charles on the cover, grinning like a king on a throne, in loving memory of the Honorable Judge Charles Whitmore. 1948 முதல் 2023 வரை, inside the program were names of the speakers, politicians, clergy.
Samuel rose from his chair slowly, the kind of unhurried motion that comes when there's nothing pressing ahead of you and nothing behind you that can't wait. The porch boards gave a soft creak under his weight, a familiar sound that had been part of his days for as long as he could remember. He placed his hat on his head out of habit rather than need. The evening light was gentle now, with no edge to it, and rested his hand on the worn porch rail for a moment before stepping down. The grass in the yard brushed against his boots as he crossed toward the old gate. He had built that gate with his father in the summer after his 12th birthday, hammering each nail while his father held the board steady. The wood had weathered since then, turned silver gray, and the hinges were mottled with rust. Still, when Samuel lifted the latch, it opened without protest, swinging out into the pasture as though it had been waiting for this small journey all day. Beyond the gate, the path stretched ahead, faint but still there, a narrow ribbon of pressed earth winding between tufts of grass and patches of clover. Wildflowers had claimed much of its edges, Queen Anne's lace with their lace-like crowns, purple asters bowing slightly in the breeze, and the last of the summer daisies, their petals tinged with gold from the setting sun. Samuel stepped carefully, not wanting to crush them. The air smelled of hay and earth, with the hint of the creek's coolness riding the breeze. It was the sort of scent that settled deep in your chest, that stayed with you even when you closed your eyes at night. He could hear the faint trickle of water ahead, a sound so steady it might have been part of the air itself. Each step seemed to loosen something in him, not just in his legs, but in the parts of his mind that had been cluttered with small worries. Out here, those worries thinned, as if the open space and the steady rhythm of walking could scatter them like seeds carried off on the wind. The pasture rolled gently toward the creek, and Samuel paused part way to take it in. From here, He could see the apple tree's broad crown leaning over the water, the late light caught in its leaves. The branches swayed slightly, as though greeting him from a distance. He smiled to himself, feeling the same quiet welcome he had felt 100 times before. The sound of crickets began to weave itself into the air, their steady chorus blending with the distant call of a mourning dove. Somewhere far to the west, a tractor engine droned for a moment before falling silent. These were the small stitches that held the fabric of the countryside together, sounds that told you where you were without needing to see a thing. He passed the place where the fence dipped low, the spot where he and his boyhood friends used to climb over to play in the meadow beyond. The grass there was higher now, left uncut, and the seed head swayed like a slow-moving tide. As he walked, the
stained glass seemed to still. I waited a full 3 seconds, long enough to make them wonder what I was about to say, long enough to make the nervous among them regret sitting so close to the front. Then calmly I began. They've all told you who Charles was. I'd like to tell you who he was when no one was watching. And with that, the first layer of silence cracked. People sat forward in their seats. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. My voice was low, steady, not accusing, just clear. I knew Charles longer than anyone here. I saw the parts no one else did, not because he showed them to me, but because I lived in the shadows where he kept them. He was brilliant, yes, charming, ambitious, but he was also something else, a man who required silence to maintain his legacy. There was a shifting in the back row. One woman clasped her pearls tighter. I stayed silent for many years because I thought that's what love was, enduring, protecting, disappearing. But love without truth is a cage. I looked down for a moment, then back up, and that's when I reached into my purse. The envelope made a soft sound against the mic as I placed it beside me. I won't share the contents of this here. That's not what this moment is for. But I want you to know it exists, and so does the truth. He was not a monster. He was not a saint. He was complicated, and for too long, only half of him has been allowed to exist out loud. Today, I claim the other half. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was stunned. Some sat frozen. Others looked away. Claire stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. And in a way I had, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't speaking in his defense. I was speaking in my own. I hadn't planned to say more. But when I turned to leave the microphone, I saw their faces. Those rigid, reverent expressions Charles had worn down for decades. And I knew they weren't ready. They needed more than a nudge. They needed the curtain torn clean down the middle. So I paused, and I turned back. You've all praised his discipline, I said. But at home, it was silence we lived under, not structure. He could go days without speaking to me if I questioned him. A few people shifted in their seats. Uncomfortable. Good. I wasn't there to comfort them. You called him a champion of women in law. Did you know that 2 women, at 2 different points in his career, filed formal complaints against him? You didn't, did you? A murmur rippled through the room. People looked to the program again, as if the answers were written there. Claire looked pale now, still seated, still silent. He never raised a hand to me. But don't let that convince you he was kind. There are wounds you can't see, words that leave bruises, gasps that echo longer than slaps. Someone in the front row, one of his former colleagues, stood up as if to interrupt. I raised my hand gently. You've had your turn, I said. Now it's mine. The man sat down. The silence pressed in, tighter, thicker. I lived with Charles for 47 years. I buried my voice to protect his. I gave up my job, my family, my ambitions, because he said that's what good wives do. And when I asked for space to grow, he said, "Why would a garden plant itself in the shade and then ask for sun?" That line earned gasps, real ones, not polite inhalations. When he became ill, I cared for him. I bathed him, I fed him, I helped him dress, and still he left me nothing. In his will, I was not mentioned, not once. The man you're mourning erased me in life, and again in death. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the paper, held it up. This is a copy of the will. Claire received everything, not because she needed it, but because she mirrored him. I didn't. Eyes turned toward Claire now, her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. He once told someone I was docile, that I'd never speak up. I looked out over the pews, faces I'd seen at every church picnic, every fundraiser, every political dinner, now watching me like I was a stranger. Good. They had never really seen me before. Well, I'm speaking now. I stepped back from the microphone. The pastor looked like he didn't know whether to pray or call for security. The funeral director shifted nervously behind the altar. But I wasn't afraid. I had never felt more calm in my life, because that wasn't anger driving me. It was freedom. Claire stood suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She walked straight up to me. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. "This isn't the place." I leaned in close enough that only she could hear me. "It's the only place. And it's the only way you'll ever stop pretending he was the man you needed him to be." She blinked. Tears welled in her eyes. Not grief. Something else. Shame? Realization? I didn't know. She turned and walked out without another word. The room was still frozen. A woman from the second row stood, slowly. She looked around the room, then up at me. "I knew Helen Monroe," she said softly. "She worked with me in 1986. She told me once that he ruined her." And then she sat. No one clapped. No one spoke. The service ended in silence. Not the reverent kind, the kind that comes when a fire has passed through and no one's quite sure what's left. I walked out into the daylight. The sun hit my face like a benediction. No one stopped me. No one asked for a quote or a follow-up or a denial. Some wouldn't believe me, some would. That didn't matter anymore. Because truth doesn't need approval. It only needs air. And after 47 years of swallowing my words, I had finally exhaled. By the time I returned home from the church, the phone was already ringing. Not condolence calls, not kindness, just whispers, pretending to be concern. The first was from the funeral director. He left a tight-voiced message about how unexpected the disruption had been and whether I'd be willing to issue a clarification. The second was from Claire. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't even say my name. "You embarrassed yourself," she said flatly. "You embarrassed him." I didn't respond. Not right away. Because embarrassment had never been the right word. Not for the truth. I let her speak. Let her get the poison out. Let her say I'd ruined his legacy, that people had walked out stunned, that she might reconsider the distribution of certain properties in light of my outburst. When she paused, I finally said, "You don't own the truth, Claire. No one does. It's just been waiting for someone to tell it." Then I hung up. The next day, 3 letters came in the mail. One anonymous, one typed, one handwritten. The handwritten one was from a woman named Ruth Delaney. She had been Charles's secretary in the early 90s. In careful cursive, she wrote, "I wanted to say thank you. You spoke what so many of us swallowed for years. I still remember the way he'd look at us when we made mistakes, as if we were replaceable furniture. You were never invisible. I saw you, and I believed every word you said." I held that letter against my chest for a long time. It was the first time someone had said that to me. I saw you. I received others in the weeks that followed, some from strangers, some from women who had known Charles through work or church or bar associations. Quiet voices, finally surfacing. He made me feel small. He called me a distraction. He brushed against me and said it was an accident, but he smiled when he did. None of them wanted attention. They just wanted validation, like me. And then came the lawyer. Claire's, not mine. A stiff letter claiming I had interfered with the estate by presenting sensitive materials at a public event, and that Claire was now seeking clarification regarding the will's validity. It was her way of clawing back control, trying to remind me that she held the cards, but she didn't know about Teresa, my lawyer. She didn't know I'd already insured my legal protections, traced every joint account, photographed every document Charles thought I'd never touch. She didn't know that her father had made small, traceable mistakes in his last few years, errors that, combined with the evidence I had gathered, painted a clear picture of coercion, manipulation, and fraud. Teresa handled it all, calm, cold, brilliant. The legal challenge collapsed within 2 weeks. Claire never called again. The town didn't say much. Some friends stopped coming by, the ones who had once praised my hosting, my quiet grace. They disappeared like leaves in wind. Others came by quietly in the afternoon when no one would see them. They brought coffee, or cookies, or just their company. They didn't talk about Charles. They just talked to me, like a person, like a woman who'd been there all along and had finally stepped into her own name. I didn't try to change minds. I didn't post anything, didn't write a memoir, didn't sell my story. I simply existed, out in the open, for the first time in my life. I changed the locks, closed the church account, canceled the donation Charles had pledged in my name without asking me. I moved into a small, sunlit apartment near the library, just me and the quiet hum of traffic. I bought a new tea kettle, a blue one. He'd always hated blue in kitchens. I began knitting again, reading again. Once I ran into Ruth Delaney in the market. She hesitated before approaching me, eyes darting around like someone might still punish her. But then she smiled and said, after that day, I started sleeping better. And I realized I had too, not because I'd won, not because I'd exposed him, but because I'd finally, completely stopped disappearing. Charles's memorial was the last room I ever let someone silence me in, and after the echoes of my truth died down, all that was left was me, still standing. People still ask sometimes, though not as often anymore, "Was it worth it?" They ask quietly, like they're afraid the answer might expose something inside them too. Some ask out of pity, some ask out of fear, others, women mostly, ask out of hope. And I always tell them the truth. Yes, it was worth it. Not because it changed the world, not because it made headlines or rewrote history, but because for the first time in my life, I belong to myself. That is worth everything. It's been just over a year since the memorial. The apartment I live in now is modest. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, hardwood floors that creak when I walk barefoot in the morning, a small reading nook by the window that faces east. I keep a tray of lemon verbena and rosemary on the sill. They're stubborn plants, don't bloom easily, but they endure. I like that about them. I still wake early, still make tea before the sun rises, but now I sit in silence because I want to, not because someone demanded it. I go for walks in the neighborhood. I nod at the children on their bikes, the young mothers pushing strollers, the men on their way to work. Some recognize me, some don't. A few look twice. Their faces soften. Not in pity, but in quiet recognition. I've joined a book club at the local library. It's small. 6 women, all over 60. We read fiction mostly, stories of other women finding themselves too late or just in time. They asked me, gently, about Charles the first night. I said, he was who he was. But I no longer carry him with me, and we moved on. That's the beautiful thing about people who've lived long enough. We don't need everything explained. We just need space to breathe. Sometimes I take out the chest. Not often. It's stored in my closet now, beneath extra quilts and winter coats. I keep it not for revenge, but for memory, proof of the woman I was and the one I refused to stay. I've started writing, too. Just small essays, reflections, journal entries, things I never gave myself permission to say when I was younger. Some are about Charles, but most are about me, about the little girl who loved books, the young woman who gave up too much, the wife who got lost in another man's story, and the widow who found her way back. Claire and I haven't spoken since the letter from her lawyer. I don't hold hate in my heart, not anymore. But I've stopped shrinking to make other people comfortable, especially my own daughter. If she ever comes back, she'll find a different mother, one who speaks, one who questions, one who no longer seeks to be understood by those who refuse to see her. The last thing I donated from our old home was Charles's framed honorary degree. It had hung in his study, right above the shelf I dusted every Saturday for 30 years. The librarian asked me if I was sure. I said, he no longer needs it, and I never did. I've learned that legacy is not what you leave behind for others to say. It's what you choose to carry forward, lightly, honestly, freely. Sometimes I visit the church, not for service, just to sit in the garden behind it. There's a bench beneath a dogwood tree, one that blooms pale pink in the spring. I bring a thermos of tea and a notebook, and I watch people. Young couples arguing softly, old men feeding squirrels, women sitting alone like I used to, silent, heavy, folding themselves into the background. I want to reach out and whisper, you don't have to disappear, but I know everyone finds their moment in their own time. Mine came at a memorial. Yours might come at breakfast, or in a mirror, or in the middle of a storm. Whenever it comes, let it. Let it break what needs breaking. Let it silence every voice that told you your truth was inconvenient. Because if I've learned anything, it's this. We spend so much of our lives thinking silence is strength. But sometimes, strength is the moment your voice cracks the room open, and the world finally hears you. They told me to just listen, to sit in the pew like a statue while they praised a man who wore a mask his whole life. And I did. I listened to every lie. And when they asked if anyone had a few words, I gave them the truth.